I arrived at the wedding wearing a well-fitting suit that was not overtly ostentatious, but I thought it was enough to command respect. When I entered the air shift, the distinct whispers of judgment started. My wife's family had always considered me an outsider, but today they weren't even trying to hide it. The setting was magnificent, with white silk drapes hanging from the ceiling, chandeliers shining like stars, and extravagant flower arrangements that gave the impression that a royal garden had appeared in the middle of the hall. Every element shouted luxury, and every glance at me shouted something else unwanted. As I approached my wife's mother, the infamous mother-in-law from hell, she intercepted me. She was not only the matriarch of the family, but also the self-described gatekeeper of prestige and appropriate image, and it seemed that I didn't fit the one she had in mind. Her look twisted into one of extreme worry, but I knew better. She said, "Oh dear, you made it," in an insincere tone, and I forced a kind smile as she looked me over from head to toe as if looking for flaws. Then, in a condescending manner, she gestured dismissively towards the very back row of seats, which were designated for +1s and distant cousins who had shown up despite not being invited. I blinked so as not to ruin the wedding photos, but their audacity was shockingly and obviously I was so ashamed that I turned to my wife, half expecting her to defend me. But instead, she shook her head and laughed softly, acting like I was a harmless, foolish mother. She said this in a courteous manner, but it wasn't a defense. Rather, it was a dismissal. I should have adapted to this by now. I felt that I should just accept my situation because my in-laws had never hidden their distaste for me. I wasn't wealthy by birth, and I didn't have a last name that indicated anything. Instead, I had worked my way up, made something from scratch, and spent my life traveling to places that most people couldn't afford. Not through inheritance, but through my own hard work. However, to them, that wasn't enough. So I swallowed my pride, went to the back, and sat where they asked me to observe while the real family took. The room was already filled with the clinking of expensive cutlery, champagne toasts, and limelight. Laughter as center stage photographers took pictures of my brother-in-law and his fiancée. However, as I turned to face my wife, everything vanished into the background. She had once declared that she loved me because of my ambition and drive, and she used to assert that money didn't matter and that we were partners in everything. But as time passed, I saw how she had changed, enjoying the stability of marriage, to the extent that she let her family members treat me more like a burden than her spouse. Today, though, she didn't just let it happen. She laughed because something clicked. They weren't aware yet, but they would never forget this day when the stress left me as I stepped outside into the cool evening air. I couldn't sit there and let them act like I didn't exist. So I reached inside my pocket and touched the smooth surface of my phone before getting up and leaving without saying anything. The haughty grins, the mocking glances and muttered laughter vanished as I took a big breath. I wasn't angry. I was attentive. My wife's family had previously treated me disrespectfully, but today they did it in front of hundreds of visitors and cameras, some of whom would recall each time they humiliated me, thinking that I would just sit there and accept it as their first error. I pulled out my phone and went to a contact that was saved under a single word. A voice replied right away, and a smile appeared on my lips. "Give me 10 minutes, I said, and then I laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from a man who takes pleasure in his work. My wife and her family had always assumed that I was struggling because of my modest, low-key lifestyle. They believed that I lacked wealth. They never asked about my activities, where my investments were, or the depth of my relationships, which was their second mistake while they lived their lives flaunting their old money and prestige. I hung up without saying anything more. We didn't need to explain. We had planned this occasion months in advance. I had been using power to create something much bigger, and in just a few minutes that power was ready to destroy everything they had painstakingly planned. I walked slowly back inside my pace tranquil, no rush. and my seat at the back was still there as a symbolic reminder of where they thought I belonged. I looked at my wife, who was laughing, sipping champagne, talking to her sister, and several high society wives. She felt so comfortable in my silence that she had assumed I was harmless, which was her third error at the 10-minute mark. I leaned back, adjusting my cuff-lings, and then the first clue appeared subtly like clockwork. A middle-aged chef in a spotless white uniform approached a server, whispered something, and walked away calmly. A second waiter then followed. Suit. The wedding went on, and the guests hadn't noticed yet. But behind the scenes, the bartenders, waiters, decorators, and kitchen staff all vanished like ghosts in the night, and the entire workforce slipped out the back door. My wife's family had spent more. The sound of champagne glasses clinking persisted. We regret to inform you that this event will now be closed due to a breach of contract. To the uneducated eye, everything seemed flawless, but I could already see the fissures growing beneath the surface. Applause broke out intermittently. Whispers. The ceremony was over, and my mother-in-law staggered back in amazement. I just watched as the glass clinking and laughter abruptly stopped, leaving behind terrified, pallid faces. She had teased me at family get-togethers for years, brewing beneath the surface and standing stiff in the center of it all with her perfectly manicured hands shaking at her sides. I had never seen my mother-in-law like this before, not even when she practically spat at me or called me the poor one behind my back. This was different for the first time in her life, and she was helpless despite the chaos all around her. The venue manager remained calm and spoke, even though the event was coming to an end due to a violation of the contract. The guests whispered to each other, clutching their phones, as if that would put an end to the chaos. My mother-in-law blinked twice, her face gradually twisting in rage before she screamed, her voice rising to the point where people turned to stare at her. "What are you talking about?" The manager stood firm because your contract makes it clear that any abuse of event personnel is prohibited verbally, physically, or otherwise. Our employees have filed numerous complaints today, leaving us with no other choice. After years of stepping on people as though they were beneath her, I watched as the words finally hit home. Irony was a lovely thing, and this is astonishing. The whispers grew louder, rougher, and more merciless because the wedding was no longer the only thing on the line. Reputation was at stake. These were socialites, not just tourists or business people who came on a certain level. Picture a collapsing event that is stuck in the fallout with no food, music, or drinks. My mother-in-law's panic turned to desperation as she spun towards my wife, her voice shrill. "Someone, please fix this." There were empty tables, champagne spills, and the looming embarrassment of attending a wedding that had just fallen apart. People were already departing one by one, in groups and in pairs, all attempting to avoid the shame of being involved in this disaster. My father-in-law turned to his wife in the hopes that he could make things right, but he just shook his head, in silence. She realized that the wedding was over, and I had been watching her carefully as her face changed from confusion to fear as she put everything together. Her hands were shaking when she turned to face me, and her voice was barely above a whisper, but it wasn't a question. It was a fact. I allowed a slow smile to spread across my face, and then I spoke firmly that disrespect has consequences. She took a sharp breath, and I gestured towards the wrecked event as the guests fled. "It's fair, isn't it, her eyes? Ed, you destroyed our family for years, made me feel inferior, and let your family treat me like garbage. Tonight." You laughed as they made fun of me. I shook my head. She was breathing heavily now, but that didn't mean I had to stop. I had swallowed my pride for years, but tonight I had nothing left to give. So I stood up and said, in a clear, steady voice, "For those of you who don't know me, let me introduce myself." The room fell silent. The guests paused in mid-step, and my mother-in-law's face twisted with horror and rage, so I turned to the bride and groom. I'm not the poor one, as you so affectionately call me. I am the sole owner of the event staffing, company that provided all of the food, bartenders, decorators, planners, and decorators for this wedding, and now they've all left. I put out my arms because they work for me. And when you all laughed at me for years while I was building something, I shook my head and said, I think I've seen enough. Then I turned to my wife and said, Enjoy the rest of your evening, sweetheart. And then I smiled. Oh, that's right. There's nothing left to enjoy. The silence behind me broke like a dam, bursting into a flood of chaos, and my mother-in-law's voice became harsh and desperate, but there wasn't anyone left to hear her, and where your heavy footsteps pounded behind me, and he understood exactly. Who was to blame for his ideal, elegant wedding being reduced to ashes? I turned slowly and deliberately as a hand clamped down on my shoulder, yanking me back. The groom snarled his face into mine. You think this is funny? You think you can? Just waltz in here. And his voice cracked and he was shaking, but I just smiled. His jaw clenched, he didn't move, and he still thought he could intimidate me. But I leaned in close enough for him to hear that this was never your wedding. His nostrils flared, and your mother used you as a prop to show off her wealth and connections. His fist jerked, ready to strike, and his face twisted in anger. That was his final error before he could move. Two security personnel appeared out of the shadows. I grabbed his arms and he resisted, but it didn't help. I fixed my cufflinks, and then I started to go with a calm, methodical sigh. But a voice stopped me. It wasn't the groom. It was my mother-in-law, my wife, and her voice was trembling. Please don't leave. I hardly moved my head to see her. Heartbroken eyes. She whispered, We can fix this. Her lipstick was smudged, and her flawless makeup was ruined by tears. I let out a reasonable breath, and she took a hesitant step forward. I didn't mean to cut her off. You didn't mean to let them treat me like trash, sweetie. I pointed to the wedding's ruin, which you picked. Her face crumpled as I shrugged. Now, you have to live with that. She reached for me, but I turned around and continued walking, this time taking in the refreshing night air and feeling liberated for the first time in years.